The alarming state of family and domestic violence in Australia. Welcome to this in-depth analysis of family and domestic violence, FDV, statistics in Australia for the year 2023 to 2024. Family and domestic violence remains one of the most pressing social issues in the country, affecting thousands of individuals and families each year. In this video, we will break down the latest statistics, explore trends, and examine the impact of FDV across different states and territories. FDV is not just a statistic, it's a reality for many Australians. By understanding the numbers, we can work towards prevention and support for those affected. The latest figures paint a concerning picture. 90,697 offenders were proceeded against by police for at least one FDV-related offence in 2023 to 2024. This marks a 3% increase, or 2,320 offenders from the previous year. 27% of all recorded offenders in Australia were involved in FDV-related offences. The national offender rate for FDV stood at 381 offenders per 100,000 persons aged 10 years and over. It's important to note that each state and territory defines and records FDV offences differently, making direct comparisons challenging. However, the overall trend shows a growing crisis that requires urgent attention. A deeper look at offender demographics reveals nearly 4 in 5, 79%, FDV offenders were male, with 71,336 men recorded as offenders. The median age of FDV offenders was 35 years, slightly older than the median for total offenders, 32 years. The most common age groups were 30 to 34 years with 14,157 offenders, or 16%, 35 to 39 years with 13,351 offenders, or 15%, and 25 to 29 years with 12,754 offenders, or 14%. These numbers highlight the prevalence of FDV among working-age adults, showing a need for targeted interventions within these demographics. The most commonly recorded FDV-related offences in 2023 to 2024 were assault, with 46,424 offenders, making up 51%, and breach of violence and non-violence orders, with 25,414 offenders, accounting for 28%. A staggering 52%, or 47,285 offenders, were proceeded against for at least one breach of an FDV-related order. Of these, 82% were male, with a median age of 35 years. This indicates that many FDV perpetrators continue to violate legal orders intended to protect victims. FDV prevalence varies significantly across states and territories. Queensland had 16,091 offenders, the highest in the country. New South Wales had 12,206 offenders. Victoria had 9,580 offenders. Western Australia had 4,796 offenders. South Australia had 1,789 offenders. The Northern Territory had 1,586 offenders. Tasmania had 1,043 offenders, and the Australian Capital Territory had 195 offenders. The numbers show that FDV is a nationwide issue, requiring state-specific responses to effectively combat it. Many FDV offenders are also involved in other criminal activities. In New South Wales, 33% of FDV offenders were also involved in acts intended to cause injury, and 10% committed illicit drug offences. In Victoria, 29% of FDV offenders committed acts intended to cause injury, while 11% were involved in theft. In Queensland, 18% of FDV offenders committed acts intended to cause injury, and 15% were involved in offences against justice. In South Australia, 32% were involved in illicit drug offences, and 15% committed public order offences. This overlap suggests a strong correlation between FDV and broader patterns of criminal behaviour, reinforcing the need for rehabilitation and intervention programs. While family and domestic violence is largely an adult issue, youth crime remains a concern. In New South Wales, youth offenders, ages 10 to 17, made up 16% of all offenders. The most common offences among youth were fare evasion at 43% and acts intended to cause injury at 23%. In Queensland, youth offenders accounted for 13% of all offenders, with acts intended to cause injury at 25% and theft at 16% being the most common offences. While these numbers do not directly relate to family and domestic violence, they highlight early patterns of criminal behaviour that could escalate into domestic violence later in life. Addressing youth crime through education and early intervention is, well, essential. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are disproportionately affected by FDV. In New South Wales, there are 20,347 Indigenous offenders, with 55% committing acts intended to cause injury. In Queensland, there are 16,929 Indigenous offenders, with 29% committing acts intended to cause injury. In the Northern Territory, the offender rate among Indigenous Australians remains significantly higher than non-Indigenous populations. Addressing FDV within Indigenous communities requires culturally appropriate services, community leadership, and targeted government support. In New South Wales, there were 204,366 police proceedings related to FDV and other crimes. Victoria had 103,987 proceedings, with 76% resulting in court actions. Queensland reported 149,836 proceedings, with 80% resulting in court actions. South Australia saw a 3% decrease in total proceedings from the previous year. Western Australia recorded the highest number of offenders since 2018 to 19. This data suggests that while law enforcement is actively pursuing FDV cases, more preventive measures are needed to reduce reoffending. The rise in FDV-related offences in Australia demands urgent action. Key steps include prevention programs targeting at-risk individuals before violence occurs, stronger enforcement of protection orders to ensure victims' safety, increased funding for shelters, counselling and crisis support services, public education campaigns to change attitudes around domestic violence, and greater support for Indigenous and culturally diverse communities. Family and domestic violence continues to impact thousands of Australians every year. The statistics discussed today highlight the urgent need for action from governments, communities, and individuals. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please seek help. Contact support services such as 1800, Respect for confidential advice and assistance. Together, we can work towards a future where every Australian feels safe in their own home. Stay informed, stay safe, and let's make a change. Subscribe for more in-depth social issue analysis, and let's keep the conversation going.